Yeah. Did you share the group? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's lunch break with the Rabbi. Today is Tuesday, the 12th day of Elul, as we get closer to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Starting next week, we're going to be doing our class about the high holidays and different customs and reasons and things that we do during the high holidays. Today, we're still going to continue with our discussions on random facts in Judaism of why, what, when, where, and how. So, as we continue with today's class, is going to be about the very famous question as we continue with the different questions that we always have. And the question is today, why does Jewish adulthood begin at age 12 for girls and at age 13 for boys? So, there was this young child who becomes bar mitzvah, and his grandfather walks over to him, and his grandfather says, "Here, my dear Yankel, I have something for you on your special bar mitzvah day." And he hands him this beautiful umbrella. The grandchild looks at his grandpa and he says, "What's going on over here? Why are you giving me an umbrella on my day of my bar mitzvah? Shouldn't you be giving me something of a holiness, a Torah, a Siddur, something?" His grandfather looks at his grandson and he said, I think on this special day I should really give you something that you're definitely going to open up. So, getting back to our story of why does Jewish adulthood begin at age 12 for girls and at 13 for boys. In most societies around the world and in any place, we know that an adult starts responsibility. You can vote at age 18, you can get a license at 17, you can only buy liquor at 21. Nobody allows, or nobody ever suggests to say that a girl at the age of 12 and a boy at the age of 13 should be considered something of responsibility and considered an adult. Why then does Jewish law tell us that an adult, a Jewish man, is at 13, that we can count him for a minyan, and a Jewish girl, which becomes obligated, the mitzvah becomes at the age 12? Doesn't that seem a little young? Who are we kidding? Can these little 12-year-old girls or 13-year-old boys really be considered adults? Are they really considered men and women that we can count them as something? We all know what rambunctious teenagers are all about. We know what it means, a teenager where they're still maturing at 12 and 13 years old. So why then does the Torah consider a 12-year-old girl and a 13-year-old boy to be considered as an adult? Interesting to note, where is the place that we find that a Jewish boy is considered a 13 and a girl by 12? 13, we know that Shimon and Levi, they were the ones that went and they combated the people of Shechem to take revenge for what they did for their sister. And the Torah over there calls them Ish, a man. And they were only 13 years old. In the book of Numbers, we talk about the laws pertaining to annulling a vow. And we find how old can a woman be that her father can still annul her vows until she's 12 years old. Once she's 12 years old, her father can no longer annul her vow. So again, we see from a biblical references that we find that Jewish adulthood for 12 for a woman and for 13 for a man. But the question is why? So in order to understand this, we need to go back a little bit and see why does secular society determine that the age of majority and the age of maturity for a child should be at 18, 20, 21, and why Judaism differs. And the Rabbi gives an interesting explanation and looks and says, if you look at the world around us, why do they pick the age of majority for that child? That was because in many times and in most societies, it went determined of when a person was able to go out to war. That's when they considered them an independent adult, that they were able to draft a child from their home and put them part of war. Most societies, how did they be able to get their settlement? They fought, they waged war, they captured a piece of land, and that became theirs. Now, who are the people that captured the piece of land? Were the men that went. How old were the men? They were 18, they were 20, they were 21, and in some places they were even 16. So therefore, it went by the society of when they were able to integrate them into the adulthood, to be the leaders, to be the fighters, and those are the people that became considered adult. Judaism is the opposite way. What is the first mitzvah of the Ten Commandments? Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God who has taken you out of Egypt. Judaism's premise is not about waging war. Judaism's premise is not about conquering. Yes, there are laws about appointing a king, and there are laws about conquering the land of Israel. But the entire premise of Judaism is a question of believing in God. It's faith. How old do you have to be to have faith? It's not even a question about understanding and comprehension. It's a matter of applying the application of the faith towards the commandments that God gave us. At what age does Judaism consider a child, now an adult, that they should be responsible to now start observing the faith, the commandments, the mitzvahs? That's at 13, at 12. And in fact, when it does come to other responsibilities, there are other ages. For example, we find in the Torah that the only people that went out to war were from ages 20 to 60. They had to be 20 years old. We find in other things at 40 years old. In order to be a proper rabbi, not to be able to have a discussion and not to overturn another rabbi or whatever it may be, you have to be 40. There are certain things you have to be 18. There's different levels in Judaism's maturity as well. But in order to observe the commandments, that comes at the age of 13 and 12, because it tells us, and it gives us the appreciation to tell us that Judaism starts not from conquering the world, but conquering oneself. Looking at oneself and understanding and realizing that we start from the observance of the commandments. We start the maturity of age comes from the commandments. And in fact, the interesting thing is, on a side note, there's probably little evidence, and there is even in psychology and in popular sociology, to say that 18 is considered something more than 19 or 19 less than 20 and 21. It is just a societal thing that it became 18, 19, 20 based on what, as we mentioned, going back to the time when knights were officially made part of their official inheritance, or when kings made their children part that they can become the king, and things of that nature. So the age of the maturity in medieval times really depended on the profession. And in certain professions, they made them at 20. In certain professions, they made them at 18. And in agriculture, where they needed that help earlier, you became a man at 15, because that's when you were able to help in the field and schlep the potatoes. That's when you were part of it. So where we find the concepts of throughout societies of why they decided of different ages, why people should become mature at a certain age, was based on the need of that society. Judaism, on the other hand, who though may have a military, who though may conquer a land and have a king and everything else, but that is only afterwards. That's an afterthought. The first step is an observing of the commandments, and that's what defines the Jewish people. What defines the Jewish people as a nation, as a people, as maturity, means observing of the commandments. And that already starts at the age of 12 and 13, that we know that then the child in development understands and appreciates the value of a mitzvah and the importance to keep the mitzvah. That's on a very basic level. But as you know, that in everything, when we look at the regular systematic reason behind it, and then we try to pry a little bit deeper and to see beneath the surface and the mystical reason behind it. And over here, Hasidism and Kabbalah explains that there's also a deeper understanding of why a boy at 13 and a girl at 12, what happens. Because a boy and a girl at that time, they go through a transition in life. Not just a physical transition, not just hormonal transition, but a transition, a soul transition. As we know that the Kabbalists explain that at 12 for a girl and at 13 for a boy, they have a maturity, a soul maturity. The soul matures to a way that it is now able to combat and understand and appreciate the difference between good and not good, right and not right, evil and dark, and so on. What the Torah over here tells us is that we know the Kabbalah explains that when a person is born, the first thing that enters into the human body is the human soul. The soul that gives the person vitality to live, that gives them the ability for his physical and emotional well-being. But after a person reaches the age of 12 by a girl and 13 by a boy, all of a sudden enters into the body a soul, a godly soul. And when that godly soul comes in, it's the antidote to the human soul, which then has the obligation to fuse together to make this world a holy place by the observance of the commandments. It is that why you find at times that the evil inclination is called an old fool and the godly inclination is called a young child. Is because everything we do in our life is motivated by the human soul and by the godly soul. Everything we do for ourselves is motivated by the human soul. Everything we do for somebody else or to fulfill the mission and the purpose of why we were put here in this world is for the godly soul. Thus, when a child reaches the age of bar and bas mitzvah, which is 12 for girls when the godly soul comes into them, and 13 for boys, they now have the ability to serve their existential reason and purpose of why they were put in this world, going beyond their natural selfishness. The concept of maturity means a person by nature, you take a child is born. What does a child do the moment it's born? All it does is wake up its parents in the middle of the night. All it's interested in is eating or pooping or whatever it was. There's no kid, doesn't care about anybody else. Absolutely selfish. What is maturity? Maturity means that we teach the child to be able to be less selfish and more selfless. And at the age of 12 and 13, the child then becomes a more of a selfless individual, and the godly soul helps it become and mature that it should realize to do more things that are selfless towards its mission in the world than selfish and just satisfying its pleasures. The question we have here, does animals have souls? Yes, they do, but not at the level of humans. Everything in this world has a soul to a certain extent. The more active it is, so to speak, that means inanimate objects have souls, vegetation have souls, animals have souls, but the level of each one is greater depending on its level and as it goes higher on the chain, so to speak. What we see over here is the concept of maturity exists and comes to a child, and why Judaism says 12 and 13 has more to do with the godly intuition which is within the person than the physical change. Though many ask, why then is a girl at 12 and a boy at 13? And this we find, the following explanation we find is given because we look back when the first human being was created, Adam. And it says that Adam was alone, and God then took from Adam and he built Eve from Adam. Why did he have to build Eve? Why couldn't, if Adam and Eve were together, if Adam was created androgynous, that he had two sides to him, and all God did was split them, why did he have to build them? And over here, the concept that the Kabbalists explain is that the word in Hebrew for binyan, which means to build, if you switch the letters around, also comes from the word bina, which means understanding. And with that, it says in the book of Proverbs, bina yiseira nitna be'isha. And it's brought down in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Nita, that God that teaches us that God put more maturity in a woman than he did in a man. It comes from the word bina, which means understanding, which we translate to a level of maturity. Chachma means the idea, but in order to take the idea and break it down into pieces, you need to have a little bit of maturity. You need to have understanding, which is the word bina. Finally, when they reach the level of bar mitzvah, they're called bar das. They then get das, which means application. So children, when they reach the age of 12 and 13, they have the level of das. They're able to take all the concepts and bring it down and apply it and understand, as the Talmud says in the book, in the Tractate of Brachos, if one doesn't have das, if one doesn't have application, doesn't have knowledge, then he doesn't know how to differentiate. Because the soul, the godly soul, comes into the human being at 13 for the boy and 12 for the girl, it gives that person the opportunity to understand and appreciate and recognize the differences between good and bad, dark and light, and to make the right choices. Interesting to note that modern day psychology also acknowledges that, discovered that girls tend to optimize the brain connections earlier than the boys. And this is not only a Kabbalistic thing, but they also find that this is a real idea, and I'm sure you can speak to many parents and you will see that girls tend to mature or gravitate the level of maturity much quicker than boys do. And for that reason, girls level of maturity. As we mentioned, the concept of bar and bas mitzvah is not how strong and how adulthood they look, but it's more about the maturity of the godly inclination that gives them the idea that they should look more at their mission than at themselves. So in summary, we have, number one, it's because Jewish nationhood is founded upon the concepts and defined by the Torah, and therefore the age of maturity is an age when one can perform the mitzvahs, or can appreciate the Torah's teachings and the difference between good and bad, and dark and light. And only once the godly soul is completely integrated within the human being and gives them the possibility to push out that natural selfishness and mature him to becoming selfless and focused on its mission, then they reach the age where they become obligated in the commandments. As we mentioned, starting next week, we're going to start discussing about the high holidays. So if you have any questions, concerns, or comments that you would like to discuss about the high holidays, please feel free to email me or message me, and we will start next week discussing about the high holidays. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you tomorrow at 1 p.m.